And he sort of models himself after another self-made man named Dan Cody. And he helps Dan Cody, and in return, Dan Cody keeps him around, and he sees his potential, and um, he sees that this guy is really ambitious, and he is his mentor in a way. And Gatsby has left his home, he's left college. None of those things could satisfy him. And it's kind of like, success stories that we hear today when people drop out of college early to go make money because they're restless and they have an idea, and it usually works. So, people like Bill Gates. So he does that, but there's something else about, like we've seen before in Gatsby, and that's this self-control that he has. And I think he is, controlling to a certain extent. But the good part about that is that he has more self-control than other people who were reckless with money in terms of, women and alcohol and just really living it up. He barely touches alcohol. He sees what it does to people. It says in the text that he becomes kind of contemptuous to women who are like throwing themselves at him. And it is by a woman that Dan Cody, um, we don't really know how he um, hospitably dies, I think is the way it's described. But she ends up getting the money, and that's Ella Kay, and it was actually meant for Gatsby. So there's some half truths in the things that he has said before, but this is really laying out. Now, I like the way this is structured because um, Nick says, as we take a breath here in the story, I'm going to give you this backstory, and it's right in the middle of the story that you start to see the real Gatsby. It's also kind of interesting, though, that he, as he puts it, it was a halt too in my own association in his affairs. So he has not seen Gatsby. All we know is that Gatsby has been seeing Daisy intimately, and the one of the criticisms of the book was that you never really saw them together too much. Like all this time that's passed that they're supposedly spending time together. It's not. It's we're not a part of that, and I think it's a good thing because it would have taken away the idea of the image and the dream of her and the fantasy. I mean, this really isn't about a love story. It's about a man in his pursuit of the American dream and what he does to create that. And he creates an image also with Daisy, which I want to get to in this other passage. But before, just to go through some plot, there's one purpose is to tell Gatsby's story. The other purpose, I think, of this chapter is to kind of juxtapose Tom and Tom's East Egg life with Gatsby's West Egg. And like I've said before, Tom is always looking down on Gatsby. Even if Gatsby had more money, it wouldn't matter because there's prestige in this aristocratic idea that is very much alive during this time. Even when Daisy and Tom go to the party and he tries to point out celebrities, Daisy says, "Oh, I think she's lovely." But even celebrities at this time didn't have quite the respect that they have today, because it was still old money was just really important. It kind of comes from those just social class values, and especially people who went to Ivy League schools and so on, and their families have money, this new money, and the way that the people behave, the recklessness with the money and the drunkenness, they are looking at that like, see, this is what happens when you let people like this have a bunch of money. They don't even know how to control themselves. So before that happens, there's this small scene where Tom and a couple of friends are riding horses, and they end up Gatsby's house. And Gatsby is really curious about Tom. And the woman, I guess you kind of get the sense that maybe she's had something to drink, and she's saying, "Come over, guys, to my dinner party." And the guy's going, "No, we don't want them here." And so it's kind of this awkward situation. Nick catches on they're not wanted, and he says, "Well, I can't go anyways." And Gatsby goes in and gets his, "Let me just change clothes," and then says, "I'll follow you in my car," which is pretty awkward. Then Tom brings up, "We're going to have a dinner party, and he's not going to know anybody there. He is not in the same league as all these people. It would be absurd for him to be there." And so they end up making an excuse and saying, "Sorry, we're going to be late," and they snub Gatsby and go on their way. So you see that, and then right after that, you see the party. And you notice that Gatsby's trying to point out, maybe this person or that person. There's a producer over there and an actress, and they're really just not impressed by it. In fact, Tom says, "I don't know anybody here. This is not my crowd. We don't normally hang out with people like this." And Daisy is trying to like herself. She's singing. She's trying to, at least to Tom and Gatsby, say, "Yeah, I can do this." But deep down, Tom even points out, "Did you see her face when that drunk woman asked her to put her under a shower?" I mean, just the mannerisms, just the high class, polite society, even as flawed and hypocritical as Tom is, he's really looking down at these other people. And you notice that Tom is always like the moral police. Like, I don't know why these women, what Daisy's been doing and running around and seeing these people. And he's very interested in how Gatsby got his money in the first place. And yet, he's cheating on her the whole time. But he's always quick to remind everyone, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I don't think this should be going on. So it's only okay for him to do it and nobody else. So we get through that, and then the end of the party, she leaves. You can read what goes on in between. But what's really important is this last 2 pages of this chapter. And it starts with when at the end of the party he talks to Nick. And he says she didn't like it. And Nick says, "Well, it's okay." And he's, "No, she didn't like it." And it's almost as if like he had this vision and plan, and he has. I mean, he did all this to get her attention and did it for her. And then later on he says, like a stack of cards, with Daisy's disapproval, it just collapses. So he goes back and tries to explain what Gatsby will explain to Nick, how Daisy just doesn't understand. What does she not understand? She doesn't understand how all she's got to do is tell Tom she's never loved him. That's very simple in Gatsby's mind because of his imagination of everything that's happened. He doesn't even really acknowledge that they have a child together. It's not going to be that easy. And in fact, it may not even, she later will say, it's not even true. She did love Tom at one point. But in Gatsby's imagination, that did not exist. That marriage, the time together, it's not there. And this kind of goes into what I wanted to talk about with Lacan. Because Lacan's idea of desire is that desire is always out there. The object is always out there. Once you get what you want, you cannot want it to the extent that you've wanted it once you have it. That's why people say things like, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. It might actually happen. And our desire, which kind of comes out of infatuation. And to just give you kind of a brief summary of what that's like, because I want to get to the ego. Um, Infatuation. Freud said it's the over-evaluation of an object. So let's say you are in love with somebody, and in that process, what you've done is built that person up, almost to the extent where that person may not even be that real person. Like, people don't really actually find out who they married until they marry them, right? But a lot of that is not really that there isn't any red signs. A lot of it is because of our own desire, our own narcissistic desires to see what we want to see in what we desire and build it up. That's why you could have a girlfriend that just thinks this guy is, God's gift to women, and you're like, he just looks like a wimpy little loser. What do you see in him? I don't see anything. Well, because rationally, you're looking at the object as it is. What she's done is over-evaluate it and start pretending all these things. We've all done it. All these things about what it would be like if we got married and what kind of father he would be, and just strange fantasies about another person that we created in our own image. And that's why I say it's kind of narcissistic. And the other reason is that is a self-love. When you want something because it satisfies your own ego, let's say this person has been flirting with you, they give you something that you've been longing for. The ego loves that, and the ego gets kind of bigger, right? And so, but it also becomes very dependent on it. So let's say the guy stops flirting with you. Now all of a sudden the ego's very crushed. What happened? I need that. They did some tests on people who were falling in love and people who were like maybe hooked on cocaine or crack, and they saw similar brain waves. This is why it's important to teach Romeo and Juliet. And the way I would teach it anyways is to show the infatuation when she starts to say that he is the god of her idolatry. And they immediately can't live without each other, without ever really knowing the person. Love takes time. I bring up this during Romeo and Juliet, but there was a time I was kind of depressed. I was watching Oprah, and there was this couple that had been in a plane accident. And the mother, she's a mother of 4, she was burned just like 98% of her body. And to the point where she was almost unrecognizable. Her kids were scared to see her. But the way that her husband kept looking at her, and, he could have ended it, but he didn't. I mean, he could have, said, let's not keep her going. Let's end this. And he ends up having to be the caretaker. Okay, and this is a beautiful woman. And his entire life changes, but it becomes just a selfless act, day after day, of taking care of his wife. And to look at her and just with admiration and love, that is love, okay? Not the, I like this woman when she looks this way, and when she treats me this way, and when she makes me feel this way. That is narcissistic love. And it becomes part of the ego. What we desire is part of our own ego. And that's why sometimes when your expectation is way too high for marriage, you're probably going to be disappointed. I said this once at some sorority party, and some girls got terribly upset with me because my advice to my cousin was to keep her expectations low. She was getting married, and they went, and none of them were married, by the way. I was the oldest one there, and I'm like, you'll see, I'm right. And because if you don't, and you have these certain expectations and someone doesn't meet them, then you're more likely to be unhappy. You're going to suffer. And so, what Gatsby doesn't see is that he's created his own image of Daisy, and that it's really romanticized. In fact, this passage that I'm going to read is all about romanticism. He's really no different than Tom in his football game days, than when he met Daisy and they kissed for the first time. So I'm going to read this part. He says, "I'm going to fix everything the way it was before." Oh, this is when Nick says, "You can't repeat the past." And he says, "You can't repeat the past." Of course you can. You know, he's created himself in his own image. He's become a self-made man. He's controlling. He can do anything that he wants to do, even if it takes another person in his imagination, in his mind. So he says, he talked a lot about the past, and I gathered he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then. But if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. And I want to suggest that and use a little bit of Kristeva theory here, because it's psychoanalysis, which is when we talk about narcissism, that's basically what we're doing. We're trying to see what is it that makes us desire certain things in the first place, and then over evaluate what that means, and then to take it in as, you know, the fantasy is always greater than the reality. So that is something that I think psychoanalysis in literature definitely go hand in hand. So if you start with Freud and the Oedipal complex, you know, that the son wants to kill his father and marry his mother. The mother is a major, even if you don't believe in Freud, and a lot of people just disregard that. Later on, Kristeva with the whole castration, like we were just penis envy, which I always thought was kind of a ridiculous idea. Like she said, with the Big Bang Theory, there's just no proof of that. But she is very interested in the mother, and so is Lacan. And so we already know that there is somewhat more of a fascination with the mother. If there wasn't a fascination with the mother, then we wouldn't have these double standards. Because remember, we're going to go backwards here and think, why do we do this? What are we missing here? Okay, so according to Lacan, we'll start with the Oedipal theory. We have that. So there's fascination with the mother. And then Lacan comes up with the mirror stage. And this is when the infant is probably one and a half, something like that. And he discovers himself in the mirror for the first time. If you've ever watched a child, you'll see that this is true. It's a realization that I am not my mother, that I am me and I am separate. Now, Kristeva says that this is, I think she calls this like powers of the horror, and it's what it has to do with the fact that you're happy about it. You're happy to be an individual. You're happy to see yourself. You love yourself. You're like narcissist. I'm like, look, there's me. It's me. But at the same time, there's also a feeling of disconnect, because before the realization, the face that you've been looking at for so long and the eyes you've been gazing in is most likely your mother's. And even it goes a little bit further, because they're interested in also kind of subconsciously language. Lacan was really interested in that. And you know, sometimes we actually do say what we mean. It comes out. Sometimes we call this a Freudian slip. It just happens. But the irony of it is it's usually true to a certain extent. And it's kind of scary, because we were trying to be so self-controlled, and then this truth came out. So where does that come from? Well, Kristeva looks at it as like the Oedipal prime, of like the language that we we don't have it yet, but what we hear when we're in our mother's womb is her rhythm of language and her voice. And I think for Kristeva, what she's saying is, if I take this to literature, it seems like every quest is a quest back to the mother, which would make sense because the mother, in that part of you, is where you feel the most secure. You know, that time of hopefully if you were breastfed, or, you know, and hopefully if you were not neglected. Now, notice if you are neglected, that you're more likely to become narcissistic. Why? Because you figure out early on that the only way you're going to feel loved and fulfilled is if you love yourself. And that is just a self-help mechanism that's very healthy. It comes in like, you know, like inflammation comes in. It comes to heal, but too much of it causes disorders. And narcissism is a disorder. And so, going back to Kristeva and the mother, in one way, the child is, you know, happy and independent. In another way, though, there's a kind of resentment towards the mother. And you don't, this is unconscious. You don't really remember, but you can remember your mother's voice. And if you look at even like the text, and this is what we did in women in literature classes, look at the text of the sound, the rhythm, Daisy's voice. It's tantalizing. It reminds them of something. They're not really sure what it is, but that rhythm and that sound is kind of the symbolic, poetic language. And I think people get closer to the truth when they write and study poetry, because that is something that is coming kind of unconsciously to them. Just like sometimes I can lecture much better if I don't write out my notes. If I'm just on kind of like what I'm doing now, I have to let it come naturally. Okay, so you have that mirror stage. You have first the Oedipal stage. There's this connection of language. Now I'm going to read this next part. One autumn night, 5 years before, they had been walking down the street where the leaves were falling, and they came to a place where there was no trees, and the sidewalk was white as moonlight. They stopped here and turned toward each other. Now it was a cool night, that mysterious excitement in which it comes to 2 changes of the year. The quiet lights in the houses were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalk really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it if he climbed alone, and once there he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. You notice that feminine language is usually associated with the landscape. And I think this is, whether consciously done or whatever, it's a green breast. Later on, you see what happens to someone else's breast. So we'll go back to that later. But his heart beat faster as Daisy's white face came upon his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed, his unutterable visions of her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for the moment longer, to the turning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. As his lips touched, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Think about fantasy and the word incarnation in a religious sense. This is like the incarnation of Christ. That Christ is born of a virgin and of the Holy Spirit. He becomes flesh, but he is also in essence God. right? So that language right there to say that she blossomed for him and the incarnate was complete, that fantasy became flesh. And that became his reality. Um, Now, that's only in his head. Who knows what she's thinking? She may be thinking about something totally different. It may not be the same for her. But the romanticism is the wanting to hold on to that one moment that you felt secure in love, which is very similar to a moment that probably is very unconsciously set in your heart and your mind in a very comfortable position that you've had with your mother. And I think this is also why the expectation of mothers are so different, because when we look at our mother as a reflection of ourself, then we want her to do what we would want to do. And if she doesn't behave that way, if she goes against the current, if she is her own woman, even if later on you can learn to respect it, I think at some critical time in a child's development, there is some resentment there. And if you've listened to my lecture on A Doll's House, why Nora's leaving was so controversial, if it were a man who left, people would say, it's too bad. If it's a woman who leaves, then it's unheard of. In fact, change the story, because that's not the way the story is supposed to go, because that is not who she's supposed to be in my image. And so, but think back to that rhythm, that elusive voice that you remember probably before you were even born, what you heard, what that rhythm, it's poetic. And so listen to this last part and hopefully you'll get it. Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there were more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. So there it is. Now imagine if you were not reading this with any kind of idea of psychoanalysis, it probably wouldn't mean that much to you. But if you have the task, and you do, to write about literature on a much higher level, is it not easier to be able to say what it is and take a feminist approach, even to, and this is why this was taught in women in literature when at first it didn't make sense to me, because where's the women? The women are always there. As long as a mother is, as somebody is born of a mother, the woman and her influence is always there. And I think Kristeva is right. I think that it does, that what we really truly long for is something that's lost, and we can't ever recover it, but we may be able to get a bit of that back with the right voice, the right mother figure, the right, woman or whatever that takes that place, especially for men in literature and, a book like this. Okay, so that's all for chapter 6. Thanks.